In this video, we find ourselves right in the middle now of the beginning of the Enlightenment, or the Renaissance. Copernicus is beginning to realize what comes to be called the Copernican Revolution, which is the idea that instead of everything revolving around us on Earth, we are not the center of attention. Even though it seems like the Earth is sitting still, in fact, we're the ones moving in relationship to the sun. This is the page which changes our view of ourselves and our relationship to the world around us. You see here at the center, the sun, and us, just a little off center, just a little out of the spotlight. In the year 1600, Giordano Bruno is executed after having been declared a heretic by Pope Clement VIII. He's sentenced to death by the Inquisition and burned at the stake for the idea that the universe is infinite. Specifically, Bruno thinks that every star in the night sky is in fact another sun, and around these other suns might be other worlds, and on these other worlds might be other people, not unlike ourselves. This idea that we as humanity, instead of being special, could be commonplace, proved to be a bit too much for the society at the time. Of course, Bruno was right. Each star in the night sky is a sun. But as we had identified when we discussed Socrates, even if you're technically correct, if the society you're in doesn't want to hear it, it can be dangerous for you. I don't believe that has entirely ended even today. Francis Bacon inaugurates the scientific revolution, which also characterizes the Enlightenment. His text, the Novum Organon Scientiarum, lays down the foundation for what would come to be called the scientific method. At first, the scientific method is rough around the edges. It has not been refined down to what we know of today as hypothesize, experiment, observe, and refine your theory. What Bacon wants his audience to do is simply look at the world, test your ideas with an experiment, and write down the results. That's it. Those three simple features: go look, test, and record, makes all the difference and is responsible for every single modern technological miracle which we enjoy today. The modern world is laying down the foundation for our society. The very means by which I can record this video and you can watch it has its origin in the 17th century. Galileo picks up on and advances Copernicus's theory, but he runs afoul of the Catholic Church's arm of the Inquisition, because in popularizing this idea, Galileo is to a certain extent undermining scriptural authority, which in some particular verse of the Bible claims the earth does not move, when Galileo argues correctly, but it does. The logical implication that therefore the Bible, instead of being infallible, might be wrong here or there, is a threat to the power and authority of the church. So Galileo is placed under house arrest, threatened with torture, and censored. He cannot tell anyone about his ideas. Enter onto the scene Rene Descartes. Descartes has quite a challenge for him. The Inquisition and the Catholic Church are killing heretics. Science is under threat because of the danger it poses to official Christendom, at least perceived danger. Perhaps, if not likely, actual danger. But that's a different debate. What Descartes needs to do is make science possible under the nose of the church. What he wants to do is make it possible to doubt everything. The sort of skepticism which is required for science is terrifying to the church. Doubt everything? How can the church survive that critical inquiry? Well, if not for Descartes, it would be tough to tell. But Descartes is able to do something ingenious. He's able to throw the church, and the Inquisition especially, off of the trail of the scientists, to mislead them on a wild goose chase. So that way scientists can be skeptical, which would be required for the scientific advancement that we know as a hallmark of the Enlightenment. This quest for certainty is accomplished through what is called methodological doubt. That is, doubt everything that can be doubted. Only then can we ensure that we're not fooling ourselves. Descartes is continuing Bacon's project. But in order to do so, he needs to make it safe for scientists. Let's see how he does. Descartes leads his readers on a thought experiment. A thought experiment in which he himself demonstrates how to doubt effectively and completely. What he writes is that it is in fact possible for him to doubt so much so that he could even doubt his own body exists. The reason why he can doubt this is because of the experience of having dreams. In a dream, we think we're in a different place, doing a different thing, than where we actually are and what we're actually doing. I could be dreaming I'm winning the scoring goal in the final match of the World Cup. Running down the field, the cleats digging into the turf, raising my hands in celebration while the crowd goes wild. But in reality, during all that time. I was laying in bed, snug under the covers, not wearing cleats, not in a stadium, and all by myself. What this indicates to us, Descartes writes, is that we cannot trust our senses because from time to time they lie to us. Now, if we can't trust our senses, how can we do empirical science? This is quite a conundrum. Science appears thoroughly undermined. Our senses deceive us in many different ways. We can have hallucinations or see mirages. And so, Descartes tries to see if he can take even one step further. If he doubts he has a body, could he doubt he has a mind? And that's where he discovers, no, he can't go that far. Because in the process of trying to doubt that he has a mind, he discovers that his mind is engaged. And while the entire world could be an illusion, we could just be dreaming. There's at least one thing he can know for sure, that he exists as a thinking thing. This is the origin of the famous phrase, cogito ergo sum, which means, I think, therefore I am. This is an often misunderstood phrase. For Descartes, it's the logical conclusion of methodological doubt. In the process of doubting everything, there's one thing that cannot be doubted, and that's the existence of at least my mind. That I could not be fooled on. The entire external world could be an illusion, I can't tell. But at least I know that I am. And that's better than not knowing anything. But that is a shaky start to build a foundation for all of scientific inquiry. How in the world is he going to get forward from there? Descartes' next step in the following meditation is to make the claim, I know I have an idea of God. Now this, while correct, is followed up by something that is technically a fallacy. Rene Descartes likely knows this is a fallacy. But in a Machiavellian sense, Rene Descartes is willing to be a little sneaky, a little cunning, a little conniving, to tell a small lie to serve a greater purpose. This could be called the ends justify the means. It's wrong to commit the logical mistake, the philosophical fallacy Descartes is about to commit. But if it serves the purpose of making scientific inquiry possible, perhaps one little logical fallacy could be forgiven in the long run. Descartes goes on to claim that in addition to knowing he has an idea of God, that the idea of God must be innate. It must be inborn, stamped on our minds or souls from birth by God. His logic for why this is because the idea of God is perfect. And he argues that a perfect idea could not have come from the external world, because there is nothing perfect there. For that reason, this perfect idea of God must be inborn or innate. Later philosophers, such as John Locke, who we'll be discussing soon, points out nearly a century later, the idea of God is not inborn, it's learned. It doesn't make it less valuable. Descartes just has an incorrect epistemology. We could almost imagine Descartes saying, "Shh, I know that. You know that." But the Inquisition doesn't realize it. To the Inquisition, this makes Descartes and the scientists following in his footsteps sound utterly pious. As in, we're all good Christian men here. Nothing revolutionary going on behind the scenes, scientifically. We all believe in God, so our scientific skepticism isn't a problem. You can see how effective this intentional logical misstep likely would be. So, for Descartes, the idea of God is innate, it is perfect, and if God is perfect, then God must be good. And a good God would not deceive me by trying to trick me into thinking there's a world when there's not. So, in fact, this perfect, innate idea of a good God allows me to trust the senses again. In fact, the world is as it actually appears, because God would not fool us and allow us to be deceived if it were otherwise. The upshot of this is that when the Pope had refused to look through Galileo's telescope at the moons of Jupiter orbiting Jupiter, for Galileo proving that the earth is not the center of all things. In fact, because there's a trustworthy God, we can be confident that our eyes do not deceive us, and that even though there's this small problem that observation does not perfectly match up with Scripture, perhaps that can be overlooked. After all, we're just studying God's creation to try and better understand the mind of the Creator. In this way, Rene Descartes makes modern science possible. On the one hand, by allowing scientists to doubt effectively without fear of recrimination, torture, or execution by the Inquisition arm of the Church. And two, by making it possible to trust the senses, that when we, in his words, clearly and distinctly perceive how some feature of the world works, we can trust that our understanding if we've been rationally careful, is accurate. Even if this creates nagging problems for theology. But Descartes isn't done just yet. In a text called The Passions of the Soul, Rene Descartes manages to make medical science also possible. Prior to Descartes' time, the prevailing opinion of the society and the official doctrine of the church was that if a person was sick, it was their own fault. They had done some sin in secret and refused to confess it to the priest. Thus they are cursed by God with illness and disease. And so, late medieval physicians and doctors can't treat their patients because they would be messing up God's plan. Descartes, in this context, is a humanitarian. He wants to ease the suffering of people's lives. And he believes that modern medicine can aid in that endeavor. But to do so, he needs to make it possible for doctors to practice medicine and not be in conflict with the clergy, who believe that sickness is a matter of the soul, and therefore their purview to address. Descartes accomplishes this in a similar sneaky way. He makes a division between the mind and the body, what's referred to for the next 3.5 centuries until our time as mind-body dualism. This dualism sets the trajectory of intellectual history and philosophy on a tangent for 3.5 centuries, in large part down until today. We are just beginning to get off the sidetrack that Descartes was required to necessarily set up in order to make science and medicine possible under the auspices and down the unpleasant nose of the Inquisition arm of the political Roman Catholic Church. I only make such specific claims about the church in this way at this time because it is the political power which was significantly repressive to intellectual progress and development. The history of philosophy in the period of modernity is tied up with the politics of the church. And that is not a matter of opinion, but instead of fact. This mind-body dualism identifies that the mind is the immaterial soul, the divine spark, and that the body is material and physical and mechanistic. The body is like a machine. So, if a person is sick, then the physician can tinker with the moving pieces, like a watchmaker might repair a stopwatch or pocket watch that's losing time by putting the pieces back into order, resolving them from disorder. And if a person has committed some sin, in that case, they would be soul sick and under the purview of the priests. So that when the doctor treats the patient, he's not affecting the soul, he's only affecting the moving parts, the machine. The ghost in the machine, that's a matter for the priests and God. But tinkering under the hood, messing with the engine, that's the job for physicians. Descartes has an especially perceptive young student who says, none of this makes any sense. If the mind is immaterial and the body is material, how could those two substances manage to interact? Descartes' paltry response to his perceptive student amounts to little more than, never mind that, it's not a problem. But it is a problem. The mind-body dualism, at the end of the analysis, doesn't add up. In later centuries, philosophers would continue to question the suppositions inherent in Descartes' dualistic philosophy. And by the late 20th century, argue that, in fact, there's really no need for a soul at all. The workings of the mind likely can be completely explained as a byproduct of the physical processes of the mechanics of the brain. The mind is nothing more than the workings of a specific part of the body. No divine soul, no divine spark, no immaterial stuff, no ghosts or supernatural explanations needed to make sense of what we understand as consciousness. And we can almost imagine Descartes snickering that it takes more than 300 years to pick apart his scheme. To uncover and untangle the knots of logic he had left for us. And to see that at the end of the day, his philosophy was wrong. But perhaps wrong in a useful way. Or even more specifically, wrong in an intentional way, relevant to his historical, social, and cultural context. The Inquisition would not stop killing people for another 200 years. And yet, by the time the Inquisition officially ends in 1828, the entire modern world is set up. And we find ourselves, most of you, born at the very tail end of the 20th century, the inheritors, the descendants, the heirs to this intellectual fortune, to this technological project. We are the beneficiaries of these struggles between religion and science to make sense of why the world is the way it is. The history of the intellect and the ideas that we've been discussing are our birthright. What we choose to do with our inheritance is now up to us.